Terrific. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started because we've got a very full schedule for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, whether you're watching live or in the recorded version. We're really glad that you're here with us. My name is Gabi Conacher. I am the co-founder and president of Wishes for Elliot, and Deep Connections is a project of Wishes for Elliot with about 25 different patient advocacy group collaborators, not to mention all the fantastic people you'll be hearing from today we collaborate with as well. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. We are recording this session. It will be available online in a few days. All of the participants are muted and have video off, but throughout, if you have questions or clarifications or anything, please feel free to put them into the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll find them there and get to those towards the end, unless there's a clarification that needs to take place during the presentation itself. Thank you again for joining us. I'm first going to introduce Jayetta Hecker. She is going to speak kind of from the caregiver role today as grandmother to Elliot, my almost 8-year-old who has SCN8A related epilepsy and really refractory epilepsy. So she's going to kind of share her perspective in the lens of curing the epilepsies. And after she shares, I'm then going to introduce our other speakers. So Jayetta, why don't you come up? Jayetta has a long history of working in, I don't mean that like it's an old, but you know, long history of working in advocacy and really promoting stronger, healthier systems. And so she kind of took her experience of 40-some years in federal government, and once she retired, I had Elliot, and she kind of transferred her skills over to the epilepsy space. She's been very active in the Epilepsy Leadership Council, the Rare Epilepsy Network, and a number of other collaborative groups and working groups. So Jayetta, I'm gonna go ahead and let you take it away.
So I have control of the slides? Yes. Well, you can control them. Okay. Thank you, Gabi, and thank you everyone for being here. This is kind of an exciting moment. I think all of us struggle with wanting to do something, wanting to make a difference, knowing things need to be changed. And this is the time. And it's the time for thinking big. And basically this opener, it's the time to think about a moonshot. You know, I was actually alive when JFK talked about going to the moon, and it was so audacious. It was so unbelievable. And the country came together, and lots of specialties came together, and it was done. But more recently, this concept of it has been applied to healthcare, and many of you may have heard about the moonshot, cancer moonshot. So that idea of a moonshot is, oops, a moonshot, is really thinking boldly, and then a community coming together in a very profound way to work on a common audacious vision. So next. So what I bring, as Gabi said, is a perspective of both a caregiver and an advocate. So as she said, I've been a grandmother to Elliot. I was actually at his birth, and an active caregiver throughout. And he is very profoundly affected by a sodium channelopathy genetic disorder. About when he was a little over a year, when we realized that there were no answers and no one knew what to do, we were advised, frankly, by his genetic neurologist that, yes, it's true, we don't know anything, but if you get engaged, you can really make a difference. It's a very auspicious time to advocate and to really bring the community together, which is exactly what we did in many different ways. Basically, I'm going to review 4 problems that we've had with Elliot's care that are linked to underlying lack of knowledge or absent standards of care. And the first one was the absence of an early care protocol. He was clearly having seizures. We had a neurologist. She kept him on the same drug, just titrating upwards for 10 months, despite continuous degradation of his condition and almost constant seizing. And it was only that he was sent for an EEG, where the doctor observing it walked in minutes after it started and said, "I don't usually do this, but this child needs to be admitted immediately." That we finally started getting some attention to the serious problems he had. And that was, just a lack of care, lack of standards. And go on to the next slide. Similarly, the, Gabi, you moving these?
Yeah, there's something wrong with my screen, right?
Okay, well,
keep talking.
The second one is basically about the shifts of AEDs. He'd failed over a dozen AEDs, and we were constantly having to make a judgment when there were very few left of what would be the next one. And, with a wonderful, honest, conscientious, and really dedicated doctor, it actually came to him saying, well, we could try this. And there's some evidence, given similarities between him and some instances known of how it's worked with other people, but it could also kill him. What do you want to do? And that is just a lack of knowledge, a lack of gathering health services research data. That this is, the records are out there, but there was no record for him to draw on to make more informed choices and help us make more informed choices about whether to try a drug that might help him or kill him. The next one is actually similar, and it is a failure of the ketogenic diet and having severe toxic reactions from different AEDs several times throughout his life. And each time, again, a lack of knowledge, a lack of the data being captured, days of stumbling and not knowing what to do in the PICU of an effective weaning strategy. Literally, them trying to call other people and get other information. And it seemed, how is it that that data is not collected, not available? I can get that maybe we don't have a cure, but there's got to be better data that could be collected on actual care and impact of different treatments. And it nearly killed him each of these times. And the last example is pain. The picture just tells it all, years of unexplained pain, no answers, no relief. And the real challenge was struggling to try to get all of the different doctors that we would consult. Was it gut? Was it urinary? Was it neurological? Was it a combination? And we would see all these doctors and we couldn't get them to talk to each other and come up with an integrated plan. And it was torturous. And it's just not an acceptable status quo in a time when informatics allows this kind of data to be collated, sorted, and readily accessible to doctors. Not fancy research, it's called health services research. So the next slide is basically that we have throughout been really aggressive in advocating, and we have worked with the research community, with the Rare Epilepsy Network, the Leadership Council, not so much advocating to NIH as partnering and learning from NIH and NINS, and Vicki in particular was one of our earliest allies and advisors. This is actually Gabi and John and the family meeting with Nancy Pelosi and speaking up directly to the Speaker of the House. We have done advocacy to FDA. So you look for how to advocate, how to speak up and get some change. Next slide. And the really amazing thing is this Curing the Epilepsy initiative. I won't set up all that Vicki will do, but basically they're asking the right questions. They want audacious goals. They want to think outside the box. They want to find better treatments. They want to find cures. And they're committed to hearing from families. So the big vision requires that we come together, and at the end, Eileen is going to talk about different ways, specifically families, individuals, organizations can really add their voices and add our community voice to making a difference. So thanks very much. That's my voice as a grandmother.
Thank you. I turned my video back on, but forgot about the voice. Terrific. Thank you so much for kind of setting this up for us, Jayetta. I'm going to very quickly introduce the rest of our speakers today, so you get a sense of who you're hearing. And so we have Vicki Whittemore, who, if you're an avid listener, you've seen on our webinars before. As Jayetta said, she is one of our greatest allies and an incredible resource for rare disease folks. Rare epilepsy in particular. So she is a program manager at the National Institutes of Health within the Office of Neurological Institute on, wait, no, sorry, just got it messed up. National Institute on, I'm NINS, sorry, I had it in front of me and I don't know. Anyway, so Vicki works with NINS at NIH. Anne Berg is a research professor of pediatrics, focusing a lot on neurology and epilepsy at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. We have Stuart Goldman, who is division head of hematology, oncology, neuro-oncology, and stem cells transplantation, is the Merrill Suzanne Weiss Distinguished Professor in Hematology, Oncology, and Stem Cell Transplantation. And Eileen Penn-Miller, who serves as the volunteer director for the Rare Epilepsy Network. And she's the advocacy co-chair on the 2020 NINS Curing the Epilepsies conference. And she also co-founded and is past president of Hope for Hypothalamic Hamartomas. So we're going to start with Vicki. So let me pull up your slides, Vicki, and take it away.
Thanks so much. So thanks, Jayetta and Gabby, for organizing this, and thank you all for joining today or listening if you're listening to the recording. So it's really my pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about what we're doing around the benchmarks and the just by way of background, there was the first Curing Epilepsy conference in 2000 that was actually by executive order of President Clinton, really happened because of Susan and David Axelrod talking to the Clintons, getting them to put the executive order in place to start the series of conferences, which have now taken place every 7 years. We were to have had a face-to-face meeting in April this year, which we had to postpone because of the pandemic. We postponed it to January, hoping we could meet face-to-face, but it's going to be a virtual meeting, and I'll come back to that toward the end of my talk. But what I wanted to do today is to talk to you about, if you can go to the next slide, sort of the process we've gone through with regard to both the epilepsy benchmarks, but more importantly for this call, the transformative research priorities. So the benchmarks were developed by the epilepsy community following that meeting and first conference in 2000. And what they are is really shared community vision for research needed to expand our understanding of epilepsy and how it's treated to really lead to meaningful advances in health outcomes for people with epilepsy. The benchmarks are divided into 4 areas that very quickly are causes, how do we prevent epilepsy, how can we improve treatment options, and how can we understand and better treat conditions associated with epilepsy. So these benchmarks, to be honest, really cover the waterfront. You can really find a way to fit most epilepsy research into the benchmarks. And the way they've been used in the past and by investigators is they very often in grant applications, you will see an investigator will reference this research is relevant to area 1 of the epilepsy benchmarks. If you go to the next slide, please. They're important because they really serve as a framework to focus epilepsy research, and they're also used as a way to really benchmark and report funding and progress in specific areas of epilepsy research. So all of the organizations together with NIH track and code the research that's being done by benchmark areas. So we can really then identify areas of research that are underfunded, or similarly, we can find areas of overlap or areas where if one of the organizations is taking a lead in that area, the other organizations can say, okay, that group is taking a lead, we'll find other areas to really focus our research funding. So in the next slide, please. So the benchmarks have been revised about every 7 years and have been revised again. And that was the topic of a previous webinar that we had that specifically talked about those benchmark areas. And what we've done this time, which is new and different, which is to really try to push the community to think about what we're calling transformative research priorities. So what are audacious goals that could seriously move epilepsy research forward? So not just the next set of experiments that a researcher might do, or not just the next grant that an investigator might submit to a funding agency, but what would really push the field forward. So we're trying to challenge the field and challenge all stakeholders to think outside the box and think about what's possible to accomplish if we all work together on this, as Jayetta said. And so to think about what's needed to find better treatments and cures for the epilepsy. So these are meant to be big vision research goals that will require the community to come together to support and implement. And they're similar to, as Jayetta said, the moonshot grand challenges for cancer research, the BRAIN initiative, really big goals that we can all get behind and really move the epilepsy research field forward. So in the next slide. So what is also new this time around is that we've always done this, the revision of the benchmarks by holding a conference, revising the benchmarks. There's discussion that goes back and forth. There might be what we call a request for information, where we put out the request for information, individuals and organizations send their responses in. And that is one way for us to gather information. And we actually have done that for the benchmarks revisions this time around. But what's new is this public crowdsourcing campaign, where we first put out a campaign for people to comment on the revised epilepsy benchmarks. And we now have a second campaign that was launched for people to comment on the transformative research priorities. So both of these revised benchmarks and the transformative research priorities were developed by the AES, Epilepsy Research Benchmarks Stewards Committee, excuse me, and now we're looking for input from the community. So the committee put forward 10 transformative research priorities, but we welcome additional transformative ideas to come forward. So this is the 10 that have been put forward and that are part of the campaign are what the committee put forward, but that doesn't mean that's all the good ideas that are out there. And so why is it important for you to participate? It's important to hear the voices of the community and feedback on what's needed and what's important to individuals with epilepsy, their families and caregivers is critical. And all of this will help to shape research on big goals to advance our understanding of epilepsy, how it's treated, and really contribute to meaningful advances in health outcomes for individuals with epilepsy. And in the next slide. So how do you participate? Well, I'll give you a small demo, but I'll walk through this first. So there's a website where you can go to register and participate, and I'll show you that in a moment. These campaigns are open until October 30, 2020. You can also send input to this email address because some people have told us that this tool is a little intimidating and it's a new thing for the community. So you can also send your thoughts and ideas to this email address, and we'll ask whether or not it's okay for those to be posted publicly. We hope so, but that's another avenue. And then all of this input will then help to shape the agenda for the upcoming Curing the Epilepsies conference that will take place in January 2021. So the next slide. I guess I can go to the demo here and share.
I'm going to give you remote control.
So can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Yep. So this is what it looks like if you go to this website, ninds.ideascalegov.com. So you'll come to this site, and what you'll see is that this is a whole community, NINDS public crowdsourcing community. So if you're coming here for the first time, you'll come up to the top and click on register. And what will happen if you do that is it will ask you simply to enter an email address, and you'll hit submit. You'll get an email back just to verify that that's your email address. And then you'll be allowed to come in and set up a password and log in. We've only had a couple of instances where people's servers or firewalls have blocked them from getting that email back from IdeaScale. So if you try to register and you don't hear anything, send an email to that Curing Epilepsies email address, or there's an email address on this first screen for support as well, and we'll help you through that process. It's just, I think it's a firewall issue that is happening. But since I'm already registered, I'm going to log in. So you will look like this, and have to move this so I can agree to participate. I can figure out how to move this or minimize it. There we go. So you just put in your email address, password, and log in. And once you're here, you'll see the active campaigns. You're seeing manage campaigns because I'm the moderator, so I can manage all of these campaigns. But if you go to click on the transformative research priorities, that will take you here, that will give you information about the campaign. You can see right now there's been 4 ideas posted, 35 idea views, a couple comments, and you can then go to in the recent that will show you the ideas that have been submitted. But then the most important part is that if you want to submit a new idea, you click submit new idea, and it takes you to a form where you can talk about which of the transformative areas are you interested in commenting on. So if I'm interested in I'm doing this campaign, let's say I'm interested in talking about causes, and I want to comment on new models to study the development. And then it allows you a text field here where you can say, type in whatever your response is here, and type in then why do you think that area of research or that research priority would truly transform epilepsy research? What would success look like if that was achieved? And who would be most impacted by this research? So if you are putting something in about pediatric epilepsy, you would talk about that children with epilepsy are would be most impacted. When you're ready, all you do is scroll down and hit submit. You can also hit save if you're working on it and you're not ready to submit yet. If you want to enter another idea or 3 more ideas before you submit the first one, just click submit another, and it'll submit your first idea and bring you right back to the form. And just a note about this is that we are moderating all idea submissions, primarily just to prevent any spam from coming into the system. but we almost immediately, as we see that it comes in, are approving any legitimate idea submissions. We've actually had a couple interesting spams come through. So it's what we're trying to do is just secure the system so we don't have any spam coming through. But this is a system, anyone is, and everyone is welcome to come in and to utilize this. I'm gonna stop sharing now. And as I said, everyone's voice and everyone's comments are welcome. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jay or to Gabby.
Anne, why don't you just take it away?
Okay, let me get my slides up and I need to be able to share, please.
Yeah, you should be able to. Is it working? Try.
Oh yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, just a minute.
There we go. It's popping up.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Gietta and Gabi, always thank you. It's delightful to join Deep Connections and to see your program growing. Today, my colleague, Dr. Stuart Goldman, and I would like to address the issue of improving treatment of developmental epilepsies and encephalopathies. I'm going to take this from the perspective of pediatric conditions, pediatric epilepsies and encephalopathies, and talk a bit about what they are and the issues concerning them and the current barriers that we currently face. And my colleague is going to pick up and tell us about how his field, pediatric oncology, has been extraordinarily successful in overcoming similar barriers. And in doing this, I think it should give us some ideas for what we need to do going forward. So, excuse me just a sec while I get that out of the way. So what I'd like to cover are briefly the burden, the numbers, and the outcomes that we talk about with these developmental epilepsies and encephalopathies, and I'll just use the abbreviation DEE if you don't mind. The promise of precision medicine, the barriers that we face, and then my colleague, Dr. Goldman, will take over and give us some mentoring from his field, because as I mentioned, pediatric oncology has been extremely successful in overcoming similar barriers and has had tremendous successes. So just by the numbers, pediatric epilepsy taken all together, say in the first decade and a half of life, is not ultra rare. It affects about 41 children per 100,000 per year. However, in the first year of life, the incidence of epilepsy is almost 3 times that much. And in the second year of life, it's about that much. After that, it goes down. In the United States, based on those numbers, we expect about 29,000 children, again, in the first 15 years of life, to be diagnosed with epilepsy each year, but only about 4,700 infants and maybe about 1,700 toddlers, 1-year-olds. The outcomes, both seizures and intellectual outcomes and other outcomes, are very, very much dependent upon the age at onset. If we look at children under 2 years versus 2 and over, you can see that children under a year are much more likely to have poorly controlled refractory epilepsy, about 36% in this one study, versus about 1/3 of that if they're older. If we look at intellectual function, you can see that 38% in this study of children under 2 years were intellectually disabled, not mild, but moderate to severely disabled. About 1/4 of that for children who are older than 2 at onset of epilepsy. And if we combine these two together, you can see that refractory epilepsy with onset under 2 years, we have almost 3/4 of children being intellectually disabled compared to 1/4 for those who are older. This is not good, but this is horrific. Furthermore, it's not just seizures. These are children who have severe mobility limitations, fine motor impairments, they don't sleep, their guts don't work, they cannot feed themselves, they cannot swallow effectively. Communication is greatly impaired, if not absent. There are behavioral problems, their autonomic nervous systems don't work, they have visual impairment, and I'm sure the parents listening to this could add a host of other concerns as well. This is the group that we call the DEEs. In addition to all of these morbidities, there's also an extremely high mortality rate. These are different studies, somewhat different results, slightly different groups of patients, but all of them give you the same message. It is high. In a developed country, in a developed society, we expect no more than about 1% mortality by the time people reach the age of 20. And this is mortality that's 10 times that amount in less than that much time. It's frustrating because we're not doing a whole lot better. We saw, starting in the 1980s, this explosion into the 90s and 2000s, this explosion in the number of drugs available to treat epilepsy. And more recently, we've seen more novel drugs such as perampanel, CBD, fenfluramine, and everolimus come out. Lots and lots of treatments. Unfortunately, and this was highlighted in the ILAE evidence review of anti-epileptic drug efficacy, they, in a somewhat depressing statement, highlighted that there continues to be an alarming lack of well-designed, properly conducted trials for children in general. And this is particularly true in the DEE world, although we are starting to see a few breakthroughs. We have basically come down to a point where the treatment of epilepsy in children exists in an evidence-free practice zone. Furthermore, our emphasis on therapies has been extremely influenced by the adult world of epilepsy. It is almost laser focused on seizures. Let's control the seizures. And our understanding of how seizures happen is that it's something that if we affect the synapse or the ion channel, we can knock out the seizures. Well, that's okay, but the drugs that affect the ion channel, the sodium channel is a particularly favorite one, are dirty drugs. They don't affect just one channel. They affect lots of different channels. They affect parts of channels that may not actually be affected by your child's particular sodium channel or potassium channel mutation. And furthermore, many of the conditions that we call epilepsy in young children don't directly involve channelopathies or synaptopathies. They involve very, very different mechanisms. So we're using these dirty drugs and dirty mechanisms with a lot of side effects and only sort of hit or miss success. Precision medicine is the solution to much of this. Precision medicine is the idea that we match the therapy to the disease process, that we actually correct the pathophysiology and treat the disease and not just put a Band-Aid on the symptoms. And it means understanding what's wrong, re-regulating that dysregulated pathway. In epilepsy, we think this is a new idea. It actually isn't that new, and we have lots of examples that have been used to treat a lot of rare conditions. We use B6 for pyridoxine-dependent epilepsy. That's a genetic condition. Or ketogenic diet for GLUT1 deficiency syndrome, another genetic condition. Or dietary modification for phenylketonuria, PKU, more genetic conditions. Steroids for epilepsy secondary to neuroautoimmune disease, not necessarily genetic, and rapamycin for tuberous sclerosis. These treatments were not specifically designed to suppress seizures. What they do is treat the disease, and through treating the disease, the seizures are resolved. Today, we think of precision medicine largely as being gene-targeted or gene product targeted. So we've had remarkable successes for extremely rare conditions, such as Batten disease, which can now be treated with cerulipinase alpha or Brineura, an enzyme replacement therapy. We have Exondys 51, an exon skipping disease for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, nusinersen, which basically activates an alternate gene for the survival motor neuron 1 gene that is damaged. It activates SMN2, sort of like having a spare tire and using your spare tire, although an awful lot of work went into that. These diseases were uniformly fatal with a horrible course. They are now being bent towards longer survival and much better quality of life, much less impairment. Not just the seizures, every aspect of the disease. We're seeing autologous stem cell transplant for permanent cures. ASOs are in development. There are a host of gene-based mechanisms, treatments that are being produced. In order to do precision medicine, though, we have to have precision diagnosis. That is not the common approach in adult epilepsy. You just call it epilepsy and you treat it. In these pediatric disorders, you need to know exactly what it is you're treating. Well, our primary mechanism for doing precision diagnosis in pediatric epilepsy is genetic testing. And genetic testing has had a rough time getting accepted. This was a study that was done just a few years ago across several states looking at the ability of physicians to get genetic tests for children with epilepsy, for Medicaid covered children. And you can see for a chromosome microarray, about 30%, but then we went to single gene, 25% could get tests reasonably easily. Panels went down, exome, genome vanishingly small, and in opposite trend to that, you could see how much of the time it was denied. So it's actually difficult, or has been difficult, to get genetic testing. In addition, there are the attitudes towards genetic testing. People will just off the cuff say, oh, it's prohibitively too costly. I should be spending my money on other tests. That's really changing. Too many hoops to jump through. It's time consuming, pre-approvals needed. I've seen that in action, but that too is changing. Sometimes patients or families have to pay out-of-pocket costs. There are concerns about misuse of technology. That too is changing. But one of the big barriers has been the clinician who says, it won't change my management or the prognosis for most of my patients, and it's just kind of experimental. Why should I do it? Well, that's changing. As we see increasingly, studies are showing that, first of all, there's a very high solve rate of genetic testing. This is one study that I did with 17 colleagues across the country in 17 epilepsy centers across the US. And we found that in children under the age of 3, the overall solve rate for epilepsy panels, that panels in whole exome, which Medicaid does not like to fund, was on the order of almost a third, which is a huge diagnostic yield. The one that they would fund a little bit more often, chromosome microarray, not so much. But this kind of testing, great yield. If we take it even younger and look at neonates, this is from the Neonatal Seizure Registry by Renee Schillhaus and Hannah Glass. They brought down from a group of 611 children, they drilled down to those who had epileptic encephalopathies of unknown cause. Most of them were tested, and a huge proportion, 83%, had a diagnostic find. And it was mostly KCNQ2, SCN3, SCN2A, and then some others. In addition, something that has had a huge impact on attitudes towards genetic testing has been that it's now free for children under the age of 8. This is because of an innovative collaboration between a large number of pharmaceutical companies that are making treatments, they're developing treatments for rare disorders, and Invitae, one of our largest genetic testing companies in the country. This panel now makes it possible to avoid all of those pre-authorizations, out-of-pocket payments, and everything else, and go right to the source, get the genetic testing, and get the result. And the results are astounding. Not only is the yield high, we've already talked about that, and high for a diagnostic test is anything that identifies an important number of patients. It doesn't have to be 100%, but you can see in very young children, it's in the area of a third, just like before. It drops in older, but it's still catching a lot of patients and providing a diagnosis. But really importantly, many of these diagnoses actually now today have precision medicine indications. So if you get that diagnosis, it will tell a physician what to do or what to try, and also what to avoid trying. And that's very important. Furthermore, precision implications change with time. So you can see the large number of precision implications here, but there are also some emerging precision implications. And as research goes on, 100% of these could have precision implications. So we go back to the complaints that it's experimental and no impact. Genetic testing ends the diagnostic odyssey. It avoids continued testing that saves the healthcare system, the physician, the family, and the patient. We can now provide genetic testing, counseling to parents, families, siblings, and other family members. It allows families to reach out to each other, and I think many of you on this call have done that. And perhaps, I don't want to say it's most importantly, but for me it's extremely important. There are direct therapeutic implications that can improve outcomes. Now, the DEEs are the land of the ultra-rare diseases. In the US, a rare disease is formally something that affects less than 200,000 people. These are ultra-rare, ultra-rare. KCNQ2 DEE, for example, maybe affects 100 to 150 babies a year. Dravet syndrome, maybe 200. SCN2A, 50 to 100. Extraordinarily rare. We're not quite there. And I want you to think about what's missing. There has been that lack of urgency. It's changing. It's not that there's a lack of urgency for the parents, but you just heard about Elliot, who was left on a medication that wasn't working for 10 months. There are people who will say, oh, there's nothing that can be done. It's very sad. Others will say, well, you need to fail a lot of drugs before we send you to a specialist. Don't do anything too dramatic or costly. I can't emphasize enough. Wasted time is wasted brain. Waiting a month to see a specialist is not an option. Others will say, well, you know, there's really not much to do, the diagnostic nihilism. I hope that slide I showed you from Invitae gets you thinking otherwise. And then, very importantly, we have a lack of necessary infrastructure and networks to do much with the knowledge that we have. We have a lot of information, we don't know how to implement it. I think this first one, the lack of urgency, is changing in large part thanks to advocacy from parent organizations. The futility and therapeutic nihilism is also starting to vanish. We realize that it can make a difference, but we still don't quite know how to organize ourselves. A few years ago, I wandered down to my colleague's office, Dr. Stuart Goldman's office, and we started talking about where we were with pediatric epilepsy, and by comparison, where he and his colleagues are with pediatric oncology. And I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Goldman and let him tell us a little bit about the journey that his field has taken, because I think he has a lot to teach us. Thank you.
Well, I want to make sure I'm not muted. Thank you very much, Anne. You know, in preparation for today, I was thinking, at 2 o'clock I need to do a webinar. But having spent this last minutes listening to Ms. Hecker, to Gabby, to Ms. Whitmore, and to Dr. Berg, I'm ready to jump fields and switch to the world of epilepsy, because the story you told, Ms. Hecker, was riveting, and I'm sorry that any child would suffer and feel that the medical community is not responsive enough. And the work that Dr. Berg has been doing is amazing. I think anyone who knows her motivation, knows her passion, and knows her energy. In fact, when we look at this article, it only happened because of her passion and energy. And so I do want to talk to you about the history of consortiums for the world of pediatric oncology, how that's changed, how that's expanded, and how it's really made a vast difference. So if we go to the next slide. We know that the goals of the Children's Oncology Group, and I'm going to tell you, pediatric hematologists and oncologists in general, of course, our goal is to cure all children and adolescents with cancer. You know, as I get older, I have more Stuisms or more sayings, and you know, my clinical practice is neuro-oncology, so I unfortunately either create many children with epilepsy or meet kids with epilepsy. And we know that when I meet a family, I say to them, you know, if I do my job right, to your 5-year-old son who may have a malignant brain tumor and in a year and a half cure his tumor, by definition, he's going to have 75 years or 80 years to live with what I did. And I think the same thing goes for the world of epilepsy. It's not just treating those symptoms or treating the disease, but making sure that we decrease the morbidity. So our goal is to cure all kids, but it's also to decrease the morbidity from the treatments. And of course, we want to understand what causes these tumors, because that'll teach us how to prevent them and to cure them. Next slide. So we know back in 1950, the mortality from pediatric cancers as a whole was 90%. You know, if you think about it, leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the pediatric cancer we all identify with. In 1950, the average lifespan was 6 weeks. And then Sidney Farber, a pathologist, discovered that there was a difference in their vitamin levels in some of the kids, and started looking at folate and folinic acid and developed methotrexate. And progress happened where kids could get in remission, but then they quickly came out of remission and passed. And he made some really seminal changes. But nothing in these diseases, which are rarer than epilepsy, early childhood epilepsy, could happen if we didn't work together. So in the 1955, with the help of the National Cancer Institute, the very first cooperative group was formed. And these were very small groups with just a few institutions together. And it wasn't just at that time called the Children's Cancer Study Group, but individual for Wilms tumor and kidney cancer, the National Wilms Tumor Study Group, the International Rhabdomyosarcoma Study Group. Brain tumors were far lacking behind and weren't even treated by pediatric oncologists. Next slide. But we can see prior to 1950, 90% mortality, and a change that occurred from you can tell this slide only shows some of the tumors, but many of the tumors we've made more progress than others, and the tumors I treat, brain tumors, have had the least amount of progress, and that's due to some of the same issues that you feel and face in the world of epilepsy. But the next slide will show that from 1975 to 1979 and now to today, that now we're at the point where overall 80% of kids with cancer are cured. So for some of the tumors, like average risk rhabdomyosarcoma, we're stopping looking at new therapies to increase survival rate. They're already 96% or so, or high 90s. But we're looking at how can we reduce therapies to decrease long-term toxicity. Some tumors like diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma still have between 0 and 3% survival rate. And so we still need to make changes. You know, in 1968, the Children's Cancer Study Group elected a man named Denny Hammond, who practiced in Los Angeles, as our chair. And I think one of the most important things that happened in our group, and I hope that you will do in your organization as well, is he developed at that time, when there was 25 institutions in the Children's Cancer Study Group, an operations center for statistical support and data collation. This may not seem like a giant move, but what it did, it was able to get patients from anywhere in the country to be registered on a trial, to gather that data and have quality control along the way. And this is something I would recommend to your group as well, because as I was hearing you talk, I kept thinking, we can do this. You can band together. You have advocates that I hear on this phone that can make a difference, because it's families pushing that'll really make a difference, along with healthcare professionals like Dr. Berg, who will really move this forward. Next slide, please. So how did COG do it? Well, they got NCI funding. Money always helps. Next, they became their own entity. And by joining this, all centers had to adopt the same practices and protocols. In fact, our protocols aren't just what drugs you treat the tumor with. It continues with supportive care guidelines, as well as adopting and getting tissues for central repositories, central pathologic reviews, so that we can really be sure when we're looking at data that it's done correctly, and also an awareness. Now, the Children's Cancer Study Group had a national American League. There was the Pediatric Oncology Group, and the NCI asked us to merge in the early 2000s, which had some good and bad to it. The good was we're now a bigger group, and because these are rare tumors, we can do better studies. The bad is less competition leads to less innovation and more bureaucracy. But now there are things such as the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium, which we are a member of here at Children's, which is presently 11 sites in the US, funded by the government. The TACKLE, the Therapeutic Advancements for Childhood Leukemia, and on and on. And the COG now is over 250 hospitals worldwide, all throughout the US, Canada, Israel, Australia. And 90% of children with cancer now are seen at COG centers, and they are seen immediately. And if there's an open protocol, we put those children on. So we have randomized clinical tests, we have a strong research culture, and I believe this could be replicated and even improved upon in the world of epilepsy. Next slide. So I want to, turn this back over to Anne, but I think when you look at the comparisons and the sheer number, if we can do this in pediatric oncology, and by the way, you're not the first organization that thinks this could be good. The HIV program that has made significant change was based on the model from pediatric oncology. So if you look at the difference, and I think Anne's going to take over, I promise to be quiet in a second. I think you can do this. And I think I hear all the right people on this call to make this happen. And I'm even volunteering to help you in any way I can, because you've all motivated me tremendously. Dr. Berg, I turn this back over to you.
Wow, thank you. This is really amazing, and you always inspire me. So thank you for your kind words too. I hope I can live up to them. When we think about the problems of these rare diseases, we're not that far off from pediatric oncology. 1% of cancers occur in children, but we actually have a lot more occurring in epilepsy. The statistics are that there are about 13,000 cancers per year diagnosed in children. It's 2.5 times that much for epilepsy. And when you think that there are many different types, we also have lots of types. We're in the rare, ultra rare disease realm for both conditions. What I'd love to see, and these are just hypothetical, but you saw the number, 90% of children with cancer in the 1950s and before that died. Right now, if we think about the severe encephalopathic epilepsies, the disability, severe disability proportion is kind of like that, 90 to 100%. And what we'd like to do over time is change that. Could you imagine if we emulated what COG did, came together across centers, shared protocols, shared approaches to information, shared information? And what if we worked to the point where in 10 years, we might be able to say, you know what, it's not perfect yet, but a lot fewer children are severely disabled. How can we improve on that? And maybe in 20 years, we'll be here. We need to take the approach of team medicine, starting with primary care, family practice, our advanced practice professionals, emergency medicine, all neurologists, adult, pediatric, epileptologists. And you know what? Some of my closest colleagues now are people in rehabilitation medicine and autonomic medicine. Those are really important areas as well. And some of them have neurology as their primary affiliation. We need to develop sound, evidence-based approaches. You heard that in the pediatric oncology world, everyone is treated on a protocol. We don't have that. I don't even know that people are evaluated on a protocol. And we need protocols in place and process improvement methods in place, everyone on a protocol, and always trying to improve on what we have. And I think this is something we haven't yet understood, but the oncology world has made it their ethic that research is part of clinical care. Everyone contributes to knowledge. At Nationwide Children's, they have the motto, learn from every patient. The treatment that your child gets today is based on other people having participated in research and contributing to the preclinical trial and the clinical trial data. You will now participate in further research that may not directly help your child, but may help the next. Everyone's part of the solution. We should be thinking about having a children's epilepsy group with the same kind of goals that we have seen and articulated for pediatric oncology. All pediatric providers understand the urgency of seizures. I don't want to hear anyone say, oh, it's just little seizures. Once you fail a few medications, we'll send you to a specialist. To the oncologist, that would be like saying, we'll wait until you metastasize before we send you to an oncologist. All children should be accurately diagnosed in terms of genetics, neuroimaging, neuroimmunology, and anything else that is needed, and treated systematically with the best known treatment protocols for their seizures and underlying cause. And our goal should be to optimize the outcomes of all children with epilepsy and integrate research into continuous improvement for all outcomes. I think I am going to jump just to my last slide here and say that you can see that, right? I'm having an interesting time with my screen.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay. That we need to recognize the urgency of this condition or conditions. It is not one condition, it is many, many conditions. Prioritize precision diagnosis, connect with research initiatives, and embrace the research culture. And above all, let's make a plan. So with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne and Dr. Goldman. We've already got a fan club for you, Dr. Goldman, in the chat. I'm not sure you've seen, but let's hear briefly from Eileen, who's going to talk about how our community is trying to mobilize and bring our voices together and ways that you, whether you're just an individual or you're part of an organization, can really get your voice heard, that it is time. The time is now. Eileen?
Thank you. I want to just again, I'm so inspired by the work that Dr. Berg and Dr. Goldman have done, and just really enthusiastic to see this translated to epilepsy. And I recognize a lot of the folks, a lot of the participants, and I imagine they share that enthusiasm. So thank you both for everything you've done and for taking the time to share it with us. The call to action is very clear, and I want to encourage everybody on this call to get into that idea scale and share your ideas, support the ideas of others. You're going to see things that are calling for a COG-like initiative from several advocates. And if you think that that could be transformative, endorse that and add your stories and your comments of why you think that would be transformative. Don't wait until the last minute to share your comments. I also see some researchers that I think have been participatory, and we're grateful for you. If you are representing an advocacy organization, we have tools to help you communicate to your parents, to your caregivers, to your clinicians, and to your researchers how they can participate. They can join the tool. They can also simply send an email to the email address that's listed. But the key is that now is the time for us to share what we think will help transform epilepsy now. and not sort of be on the other side of this in the new year complaining, you know, of what we wish could happen. And so again, I just want to encourage everybody that's listening in today or watching the webinar afterwards to take the time. And you don't need, for those of us that are parents that don't have MDs or scientific degrees, you don't need to be an expert. This is not about solving the problem. It's about illuminating the issues. And I think Jayada did such a wonderful job at the beginning of this webinar of really illuminating. We need 1,000 more Jayada's stories so that we can compel the benchmark stewards and the thought leaders in epilepsy to take that feedback and translate it into something that will be transformative for our families.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I know we're running close to the end, but we have a few questions. If you all have a few minutes, we can just try to put them out there. The first one is to you, Dr. Goldman, by the new head of your fan club. How was pediatric oncology able to leverage funding from payers and industry to support research and to fund the network? The government certainly wasn't the only funder. Is that true?
That's true. And, you know, some of the original history I'm only going to guess upon. I can speak more towards the present. And I had typed this out to the very kind person in their question. The truth is that we've now established that clinical trials are the standard of care. And so we do not have denials from insurance, whether they be government insurance or private insurance, for participation in these trials. Now, of course, if something like a pharmacokinetic study, where we're looking at how fast the new drug gets in and out of the bloodstream, so that's a pure research question that will not affect the care of that child. And so that will have to have either philanthropically or federally. We also know that new laws have been passed that show that if you're monitoring, saying, I'm going to get these tests of the liver function or kidney function to make sure a drug's not having an unnecessary side effect, it's now been established that if it's a potential or known side effect of a medication, then insurers are obligated to pay for that testing. They no longer can say that's part of an experimental trial and deny therapy. But I think the most important thing is what you're doing today. I think it's going to be families. I think it's going to be working with your physician, nursing, research, all the people together in the healthcare field are going to push that envelope. And it's not, I've been doing this now 32 years, and I can tell you, we certainly have threatened to go to the local newspaper or media when an insurer won't pay. I don't think that we've ever done that, but we certainly have threatened. And there's a lot of pressure you can apply to get people to fund organizations. But I think what you're doing at the grassroots is going to make a difference. We also know now that there is better motivation for companies to fund trials. As we know, the federal regulations have changed now. Nancy Goodman, that many of you may know, is an advocate in the brain tumor world. And she has helped push the Race for the Cure Act, which will help not just cancer patients, but others, so that as new drugs are developed, if they're specifically for pediatric epilepsy, you can still apply for a waiver, or which will help a drug company then to take their toenail fungus drug and move it up the review ladder. So they have motivation by helping for pediatric trials to move forward more quickly. And also now the law says that if you're going to develop a new drug, you have to have a pediatric study as well. So I think the time is right. I think it's the people on this phone, on this webinar, and the people who may watch it later. As you band together with leaders like Dr. Berg, I think you will make this happen. I think funding will be an ongoing problem, but not an insurmountable problem.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with everyone here. And I wanted to ask you about your observation about lack of infrastructure. That clearly is a key impediment, but on the other hand, we have a number of initiatives that I wonder if we can build on, or whether we really need to be advocating for the kind of more comprehensive COG or consortium or operations center that Dr. Stewart described. We have, as you know, the quality improvement initiatives in 2 of them. We have PERC, that's presumably a consortium for integrating research. We've got so many standard setting agencies and new data platforms. How do we put this out and build coalitions so that we don't throw away all of the improvement efforts that are out there, but we blend them together to a more coherent whole?
That's the billion-dollar question, Jayetta. I'm not really sure. But I think part of, while each of those is trying to be the solution, having everyone running off and doing his or her or their own thing is actually creating more of a problem. Everyone wants to own it.
Right.
And there's nobody's willing to say, you know what, this is not mine. This is everyone's, and how can we work together rather than how can I get my promotion or something like that, which I think is fortunately a driver for a lot of the younger people involved in the epilepsy world. We have not gotten to that community across all of the hospitals and across all of the practitioners and researchers. I do think that one of the huge success, one of the pieces that made COG so successful, it is the children's oncology group. It is not breast cancer and lung cancer and prostate cancer and bowel cancer. It is pediatric oncology. It's a different set of diseases. And one of the pieces that I think has held us back is that we have really been driven by the adult epilepsy world. We need to become our own group. And that brings it more into the realm of child neurology. And that's important because the outcomes that we're interested in, yes, the seizures are pretty awful, but they're not the only thing that's awful. And we really would like to make inroads into the entire condition. And that really is the realm of child neurology and not adult epilepsy. We need our own identity.
Well, we have more questions, but I don't think we should push the time anymore. But Gabi or Eileen, did you want to add any clarifying questions or closing remarks about this opportunity, this fork in the road that we're so fortunately at to speak up with NINs really just begging for audacious ideas? I think this is pretty audacious and meets the standard.
Yeah, no, I would just add again, I mean, I think everybody on this call, please go in, add your ideas and add your enthusiasm for the ideas of others. You're going to see things like this concept recommended in the idea scale. And what we're hoping is that if it resonates with you and your community and people that you represent both clinically and patients, that you'll endorse these ideas as well and add more color to what you think, you know, will help sort of flesh this out. We don't need to flesh it out at this point. We just need to demonstrate that there's enthusiasm for the concept, and we think that there is, and we hope you'll agree and do your effort to help us in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has said that it's really inspiring, this conversation today. And Dr. Goldman, we will take your help. We'll be in touch. And I think having visionaries like you and Anne and, you know, and Jayetta and Eileen, you know, all the people on this call really are people who can see the big and see what's out there. And I think we just need to build this coalition across the board. And there's a fantastic group of people working on pediatric epilepsy that we just need to kind of get started and start, you know, building a framework for it. So I'm really excited. And this is a really motivating talk. And I hope everybody does go and share their their feedback. And I think it's so critical, Eileen, that you said you don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to, you know, be somebody who's, you know, able to come up with the ideas even, you know, just sharing. I'm going to put up again here the link. Actually, the link is here, and we'll post this up on the website as well, that, you know, you can find this and participate at this ideascale.gov.com. And there's really already some fantastic ideas up there to just respond to if you're intimidated, because we need the voices of families. Families are the ones who really drive change. You know, doctors can say, oh, but we need to have this and have this. And if you don't have parents yelling and screaming, saying it's not acceptable that my kid is getting put on drug after drug as a guess, and maybe it would help and maybe it won't, and maybe it'll be toxic and maybe it won't. We are the ones who have to really speak up and out and say that a higher standard is needed. So I think I'll leave it there and thank all of our panelists today: Ann Berg, Stu Goldman, Vicki Whittemore, Eileen Penn-Miller, Jayetta, who does a fabulous job with moderating. And just to say that I'm excited for the possibilities of where we are right now in epilepsy, pediatric epilepsy, rare epilepsy. We have an incredible community, and I think a lot of us are motivated to keep things moving ahead. Before I sign us off, I just want a quick note so that people can see what we've got coming up. On the 15th of October, some kind of an overview of what we know and don't know about SUDEP. October 21st, looking at clinical trials in rare epilepsy. This is the second in our series on clinical trials, and this one is from the patient advocacy group and pharma perspective. October 27th is looking at how and VNS and other brain stimulators work and whether they're possibly right for you or your child. And then October 28th, our part 2 in SUDEP, which is really looking at what we can do. We'll be hearing from the president of the American Epilepsy Society about their guidelines for pediatric epileptologists. And we will be hearing from the Danny Did Foundation about different types of measurements and tools. So we're really excited. That's a busy October, and I think it's going to work this time. As you sign out, I think there should be a survey. So please let us know what you thought and how we can do better. Again, thanks everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was great. Bye.
Bye.